Okay, we're going to move straight along. We are a little bit behind time for all the right reasons, because we have so much positive engagement. But next up, we have Phil McManus, Professor in Urban and Environmental Geography at the University of Sydney. Phil's research interests include thoroughbred breeding and racing, and in his presentation, he's going to look at overbreeding as an inherent ethical issue present in racing industries. Over to you, Phil.
There will always be too many overbreeding of animals in the racing industries. Before I begin today, I'd like to do acknowledgement of country, acknowledge the traditional owners of Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture. I acknowledge the custodians of the unceded lands on which this presentation was prepared, the Gadigal and Wangal people, and pay respect to elders past and present. Also acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded country in which you are currently on and pay respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person present today. Thank you for the invitation to present at this important online conference. Today, I'm going to discuss the concept of overbreeding, or the term I've used more frequently in this presentation, overproduction of thoroughbred horses. This discussion has wider implications for animals in other racing industries, but it is worth noting that the amount of money in thoroughbred breeding and racing, plus the requirements for a natural covering and for the foal to be born from the womb of the same mare that was impregnated, create differences in the structure of the breeding side of the thoroughbred industry compared to that of many other animal racing industries. One thing, however, remains constant in animal racing industries of all forms. There will always be too many animals at any point in time because the animal racing industries are pyramids with very little room at the top, and success is ephemeral. The concept of overbreeding or overproduction and the related concept of wastage are terms that challenge the thoroughbred breeding and racing industry. The industry does not like the term wastage in particular because they argue that it misrepresents what happens to thoroughbreds. Until a reliable, transparent and effective thoroughbred tracking system is in place, however, I believe that there is a purpose in using the term wastage, although I recognise it has flaws. That purpose is to put the onus on the thoroughbred breeding and racing industry to demonstrate that wastage is not occurring. The way to do that is to be able to trace with confidence all thoroughbreds and to ensure that at any point in time, their individual welfare is being prioritised. Part of the calculation around wastage relates to the supposed overproduction of thoroughbreds. Overproduction, similar to the term overpopulation, suggests that there is a desirable or agreed point at which animal production is optimal. I don't necessarily agree, as I'll explain soon. In thoroughbred industries, overbreeding could be seen as relating to the natural mating process between stallions and mares. This does not always result in a live foal. Indeed, the figure is approximately 60% of matings leading to the birth of live foals. So despite the submitted title, I will more often use the term overproduction to address the issue of the number of live foals born each year. I think that the term overproduction has been useful in the quest to improve animal welfare, but I believe that its limits mean we should not overly invest in the use of this term in the future. There are 6 reasons why this is the case. First, the term overproduction privileges economics and the notions of supply and demand. It is a market-based concept, and as such, if you can increase the level of demand, it reduces any existing overproduction. That, however, does not account for the potential scenario of increased production to match a perceived increase in demand, thereby creating overproduction at higher levels. The concept implicitly marginalises animal welfare at the same time as using this justification. If, for example, somebody was opposed to the very existence of the thoroughbred racing industry on animal welfare grounds, a concept that can be extended to other activities where animals are used for human entertainment, one could argue that any breeding or production at all is overbreeding or overproduction. Second, putting aside the above concept of overproduction, even within the confines of the existing thoroughbred breeding and racing industry, it is debatable as to whether overproduction is occurring today. This relates to perceptions and positionality, including the above idea that the term embodies a notion of balancing supply and demand. The Thoroughbred Welfare Initiative in 2021 had this to say, it's a direct quote. The annual Australian thoroughbred crop has been about 13,000 in recent years, which is a decrease of around 30% from the late 1990s. Furthermore, a greater proportion of these foals is being registered to race and is competing on the racetrack. Despite this trend, several submissions stated there was overproduction, that more thoroughbreds than needed were being produced. Others, including Racing New South Wales, argued the opposite. The TORAG found there was insufficient evidence to say there is overproduction. In summary, Racing New South Wales said no. The Coalition for the Protection of Racehorses, Animals Australia, and People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, PETA, say yes. The TORG cited insufficient evidence, while Thoroughbred Breeders Australia, TBA, on their website, emphasised that thoroughbred breeding is, quote, not a business dominated by big players. The vast majority of breeders, 76%, have just one or two mares, and that more than half of all mares owned are owned by breeders with 5 or fewer horses, end of quote. Similar sentiments were expressed in the Thoroughbred Welfare Initiative 2021 report by Vince Cox from Godolphin and leading trainer Matt Cumani, where the need to avoid elitism and enable battlers to breed horses in an aspirational manner was highlighted. There is some merit in this argument. The 2024 Melbourne Cup winner Knight's Choice was bred from Midnight Pearl, a mare with very good bloodlines that sold for $1,000 before being mated with a first season stallion, Extreme Choice, in 2018, when his service fee was $22,000. His service fee for the 2024-2025 season has risen to $275,000. Similar to the FA Cup, occasionally battlers knock off the top tier football teams, but in horse racing, this often results from quality in their pedigree that has been overlooked. More recently, champion jockey Jamie Carr was quoted in early November 2024 in the Good Weekend section of the Sydney Morning Herald as saying, probably the next thing they can do is try and limit the numbers because there are just too many horses getting bred, end of quote. Of course, we do not know which horses will be overbred, as in which horses will go on to have minimal, if any, success on the racetrack. If we did know which horses were going to be successful, the owners with the most money would simply buy success, which would damage the foundations of the industry as it tries to establish a wider support base and bring in new money. We know that bloodlines do make a difference, but there are many examples of well-bred horses that sold for large sums of money at yearling auctions and did not live up to their perceived potential. The fact that a term is debatable is also not a good reason to eschew it. Imagine dropping global warming, climate change, climate crisis, or climate emergency because Donald Trump does not like the terminology. It does, however, suggest that there may be little consensus on the term overproduction as currently used and understood. And this is due to some other reasons why the term is possibly not that helpful for animal welfare in this particular industry in the future. Third, relating to why the term is debatable is the matter of time and changes over time. The thoroughbred breeding and racing industry globally and within Australia can rightly point to the decrease in the number of foals being born each year. Australia's thoroughbred foal crop peaked at 23,697 in 1989. The decline in live foals born since then is, despite improvements in equine science, contributing to higher fertility rates and more live births per covering. This means that coverings must be reduced, making it likely that the number of stallions and brood mares is down, which is indeed the case for Australia and in many other countries. Globally, in 2019, 88,530 thoroughbreds were foaled, a decrease of 27.6% from 2007, when numbers peaked this century at 122,192. In Australia, foal numbers per annum declined from over 14,000 in 2012-2013 to just under 13,000 in 21-22, with variations in the intervening years likely relating to economic factors. This is not equal across the country, and over the time period 2012-13 to 2021-2022, the southeastern states of Victoria and Tasmania, possibly related to climatic factors, have maintained and even increased the number of foals being bred in those states. The number of foals born in Western Australia, South Australia, New South Wales and Queensland have declined. But as the Thoroughbred Welfare Initiative in 2021 noted, there are more older horses racing in rural non-TAB meetings, given the demography of Queensland and the structure of horse racing in Queensland. This is an important issue for post-racing animal welfare, despite the lower number of foals being born in that state. I'll return to the matter of scale and distance in a minute. At this point, suffice to say that the thoroughbred breeding and racing industry can correctly claim that from a temporal perspective, the notion of overbreeding is questionable because at both a global level and a national level in Australia, they have reduced the number of foals being born. Fourth, there's also a question of matching supply and demand. This relates to the importing and exporting of horses. It is apparent that although the number of live foals born in Australia each year has declined, the level of importing thoroughbreds has been increasing in recent years. Let's look at exports and imports in turn. Australia exports thoroughbreds primarily to New Zealand, Hong Kong, Macau and Singapore, although that last market is no longer available with the closure of Kranji Racecourse in 2024 for the purposes of building additional housing. These locations include places where there is no suitable location locally to breed thoroughbreds. The number of thoroughbreds imported into Australia has risen in recent years from under 2,000 per annum in 2012-2013 to over 3,000 per annum in 2021 and 2021-22. The imported horses come mainly from New Zealand, with much of the increase in importation in the last 3 years coming from Great Britain, Ireland and France. If too many thoroughbreds are being bred in Australia, why are we importing thoroughbreds? Well, the imports are often targeted to win particular prestigious and lucrative races, such as the Melbourne Cup. More generally, Australian thoroughbred breeding has concentrated on speed. It is apparent that on an international level, our breeding for stamina is generally below the quality of other countries. Hence, we import some of their best performing staying horses. It is also worth noting that international imports include New Zealand. But there's long been a trans-Tasman exchange in thoroughbreds, and if we measure movements of thoroughbreds in distance rather than international borders, the Waikato region, including Cambridge, is much closer to the Hunter Valley breeding region, and Christchurch is much closer to Melbourne than both Sydney and Melbourne are to Perth. The notions of exports and imports relies on international borders rather than distance. Hence the issue of national concepts of overproduction being fraught when the New Zealand racing industry is arguably more connected to those in Victoria and New South Wales than is the WA racing industry. Fifth, the concept of overproduction is at the scale of an industry and the time frame of an industry. This may be global, national, or at a state level, as demonstrated earlier in this presentation. But from an individual animal welfare perspective, the scale should be at the level of the individual horse, and the time frame should be their lifetime. The average retirement age of a thoroughbred is 5 years of age, but horses can live to over 20 years of age. That's at least 15 years of care to be provided, perhaps more if the horse does not actually have a racing career or is retired before the average age of 5, or if it lives to be 25 years or older. The positionality of a thoroughbred is precarious and is influenced by factors such as their breeding, their sex, whether they are gelded or not, whether they are a sprinter or stayer with potential jumping ability, their age, and so on. So I'm going to show a couple of slides here. The first one is breeding a sprinter, and it looks at the difference between a stallion and a mare, the successful mating, colt or filly being produced, and then whether it's the colt is gelded, whether it's likely to go on to be a breeding stallion based upon its pedigree, whether the mare is likely to be, or filly is likely to become a mare for breeding or go into racing. So various choices occur at various times for the horse. So this came from our 2013 book, The Global Horse Racing Industry. So this is for a sprinter. If it's for a stayer, then there's perhaps less market for a stayer, certainly in the Australian breeding industry, but there's also jumps racing, which is very controversial, and written a number of publications about that. But some horses, usually geldings, not entirely, but almost entirely, are geldings who go into jumps racing, and that can be, after they're no longer competitive on the flat. So again, depends upon the pedigree of the horse, whether it's a successful horse, a young horse that wins major races, say a 2 or 3 year old, and can be retired early for breeding, potentially before any injuries or any negative aspects show up, and goes on to have a life as a breeding stallion. And again, depending upon whether it's successful or whether the breeding industry is also a very competitive industry. And that highlights the need to think about the horse as an individual horse, colt, filly, pedigree, at age, and so on, at various stages of its career. The ABC investigative report, the final race in October 2019, just a couple of weeks before the 2019 Melbourne Cup, highlighted the reality that racehorses that were successful on the track were sent to the Miramar Abattoir at Caboolture in Queensland. This is not new. Winning the 1986 Kentucky Derby, the 1987 Breeders' Cup Classic, and being named the 1987 Horse of the Year did not prevent Ferdinand from being slaughtered in Japan in 2002 after his breeding career waned. Could anyone argue that Ferdinand was an example of overbreeding? Recently, the post-racing career of Black Caviar has attracted the attention of various groups, where the champion mare was mated with a stallion every year up to her death, producing 9 foals in 11 years. The concept of overproduction is at a scale and temporal period that cannot readily address concerns around the fate of individual animals. 6, the notion of overproduction puts the emphasis on the thoroughbred breeders. This is not totally misplaced, but the breeding side of the industry does not operate in isolation. Various incentive schemes to increase the number of horses bred in particular areas, the encouragement of syndication to attract more potential horse owners, and so on, all contribute to the number of horses being born. It is clear from the structure of the thoroughbred breeding and racing industry that not all horses can be successful, and even then, only for a very short time, and success is precarious. In this sense, the whole industry needs to be engaged in animal welfare, which I am pleased to say is happening more than previously. But the term overproduction tends to focus attention on the breeding side of the industry and draw attention away from other aspects, such as the education of young horses that might make them more or less suitable for post-racing life, or to a post-race career, or the care of thoroughbreds that never raced. In particular, more attention from the whole industry needs to be given to a genuine National Horse Traceability Register, microchipping, and to the ability to identify horses sent to an abattoir and to prevent their killing. To ensure that horses are cared for regardless of whether they are living legends that are paraded every year at the Spring Racing Carnival to show that the industry cares, or whether they finished 8th at Echuca 2 years ago, it is necessary to fund care across the whole life of thoroughbreds, and similarly for other racing animals and animals used for entertainment purposes. I'm aware of various proposals and studies being conducted, supervising some of them myself, to generate appropriate funding models, but they are beyond the scope of this presentation. So in conclusion, the term overproduction has been useful, but it is rightly contested. It is also not necessarily helpful for animal welfare going forward because it does not focus on the whole life of the individual horse. The term arguably reduces ethics to numbers and to an extent misplaces the onus for change. I'm not suggesting that we drop the term altogether, but that we use it with care. The notion of overbreeding or overproduction is definitely worthy of discussion, but is not something that can be solved within the current structures of competitive sports industries that are animal-based. There will always be animals, including expensively bred animals, that some point in their life are unwanted by the industry. In this sense, there will always be too many. We just don't know which ones and when it will happen in an animal's life at the time when breeders are planning a mating, or when an animal is conceived or born, or even when it is sold as a weanling or a yearling. Therefore, we need to focus on the whole of life experience of individual animals, recognising that they are social animals, and on the entire thoroughbred breeding and racing industry in order to improve animal welfare. Thank you. I'll leave you with some references. Thank you very much.
Okay, Professor Phil McManus now joins us live. Hello and welcome, Phil. I'll just get you to unmute, Phil. Sorry, looks like you've still got your mute on. Still muted.
Working now? Yep.
That's better. There we go.
Sorry about that. Yep, thank you.
No, all good. All good. Thank you very much for your presentation, Phil, showing the perhaps not so glamorous side and some of the challenging aspects of the racing industry. First of all, I might draw your attention to the poll that we put up during your presentation, which was, do you think it's acceptable that some animals bred for racing end up being killed when they are no longer wanted? We had 79% of respondents, we got about 86 responses there, saying no, they did not think it was acceptable. Is that about what you would expect from people attending this conference?
I'm surprised it's not slightly higher. Yeah, it is actually what I would expect. It's clearly a controversial issue. Part of the reason why it does happen, and I saw some of the other comments in the chat, is that the racing industry draws boundaries around itself in terms of time. It says that once the horse leaves the racing industry, it's no longer their responsibility. So that then becomes an issue for other people to deal with. And I think that then means that their statistics look good and inflates the positive outcomes at that point. But as I pointed out in the presentation, a horse can live 10, 15, 20 years, perhaps beyond its time officially in the racing industry. And that's where the issues are. So the idea of tracking the horses and ensuring that it's not just where they go out to a paddock and for the first time as soon as they retire and supposedly everything's okay, it's what happens after that. If a truck turns up in the middle of the night and takes them away, who's responsible for that? How's that dealt with? So I think the idea of the racing industry being confined to just the time they're in the racing industry is a problem in itself, and that contributes to some of these less than desirable outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a nice segue to one of the questions we have from Natalie. Do you think it's actually possible to rehome all the thoroughbreds that are unwanted in the racing industry? Are there really enough people and enough paddocks out there to take that sheer number of horses that you showed us in those stats?
Yeah, no, probably not. And it's to do with demographic factors. We've changed. In the past, they would have been put on a farm and there's more people had properties and farm and the horse could live there. I don't know, maybe do a bit of horse work or something. But these days, no, there's just not the property. And to look after a horse well does take time, veterinary care, food. So no, there are just too many. If that's what's being thought about, that's too many. So the producer responsibility needs to come in. The idea that if you're breeding these horses, you should take them back. And some breeders have been looking at that. So it's not as if it's completely off the table, but it would be a huge change for the breeding part of the racing industry. And it probably should be a whole of racing industry approach to do something like that, because they're the ones who have the open space. They're the ones, the bigger ones particularly, who have the resource to do it. And that, I think, would change behaviour in terms of breeding animals.
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. I think I tend to agree with you. So next question comes from Louise. If horse racing is to continue, could a genetic selection index and genomic testing be used to ensure higher quality animals would be produced? And those born that, when tested, that don't meet the genetic expectations are diverted away from racing before they're trained or injured?
It could be done, thanks to Louise, it could be done, but it would not necessarily lead to desirable outcomes. And the reasons are that there's only a certain amount of horses can win. It is a pyramid, as I pointed out, and Some horses will be more successful than others. It's precarious. They won't be successful forever. So having sound, you might then perhaps have horses that are sound. You won't necessarily have horses winning alternatively all the time, so that everyone gets a fair chance at winning as such. There will still be some horses that won't be fast enough. The other issue then is that if you have all the genetic testing, those with the most amount of money can buy the best horses. There would be a concentration of the top race horses with the richest people, and I don't think that's necessarily a good outcome either. So even though it is possible, I don't think it's necessarily something to recommend.
Yeah, fair enough. Interesting. Next question comes from Robert, who thank you for your presentation. What are your thoughts about a cap on the number of mares covered by each stallion? And he mentions perhaps it was suggested 140 per season, has been mentioned in news articles previously.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. To be honest, I hadn't really thought about that. I think there is certainly a case when we have the shuttle stallions who move between hemispheres. They tend not to be the very, very most expensive stallions because they become too expensive, too risky to move. But they tend to be the younger ones or the up-and-coming stallions. And for a few years, they move between hemispheres. So that figure of 140 can be quite low because some of those horses can breed over 200 in the northern hemisphere, the southern hemisphere, given the different timings of their racing seasons and what counts as a 2-year-old when they start racing. So, yeah, I think there's potentially you'd have to get the breeders to agree on that. That would mean possibly there's more stallions get a chance at breeding. It also might mean that there are more horses in general. It might reduce the number of horses in general, I suppose, if you do that. But it's still probably not the overall answer, but it may contribute certainly to some welfare issues. In terms of the stallions that are breeding the most, they're extremely well cared for because they're valuable at the time that they're breeding. As I gave the example of Ferdinand, afterwards, when he was no longer wanted as a stallion in Japan, he ended up in a slaughterhouse. So while they are successful, they are very well cared for because of the economic value that they give to their owners.
Yeah, thank you. We have a question about greyhound racing. If I could just divert you from the horse racing side of things. Alan is from New Zealand, where the government has recently announced the end of greyhound racing from the 1st of August next year. And from Alan's perspective, the greyhound industry, he believes, is heavily regulated and has made improvements. And he talks about overbreeding by being managed through tracking dogs. But do you think there's a reasonable way to address overproduction in greyhound racing?
Yes, I guess that we had the same issue in New South Wales with the former Premier. It was about the loss of social licence of the greyhound industry in New South Wales, and the proposal was to ban it, and then they stepped back from doing so. I see other animal-based entertainment industries as being a similar position. It's around the loss of social licence, around issues of cruelty, and a few people have mentioned various things like the use of ties, the whip being used, perhaps jumps racing, which is banned in South Australia most recently, a number of those sort of issues. So I can see similarities with other issues, other forms of animal entertainment racing industries, such as greyhounds. It doesn't necessarily... But it will be very hard to do, and I think Bob Brown found this in Tasmania, because the horse racing industry does have a lot of impact in rural and regional areas as well as the cities. There are a lot of tracks. Politically, it's a very hard thing to do to ban horse racing. And of all the horse racing countries, Australia has certainly per capita the most tracks and number of meetings in smaller places. So that's not as if there's only in Singapore one racetrack, or in other places, even New York. I think there are 3 or 4 racetracks in New York State compared to Australians, give or take roughly the same population. So, we have a lot of racetracks scattered throughout the country, and that would be very difficult to ban the horse racing industry from a political point of view.
Yeah, definitely appreciate that. And it's interesting the different contexts in Australia to overseas as well. we've got next question from Joyce. Would a compulsory retirement plan for racehorses prevent horses from being discarded, neglected or slaughtered once they're no longer profitable? It would hold the industry accountable for the long-term welfare of the horses it breeds and races. And I guess interesting because you talk about at the moment they're only responsible once it's left. So do you think there needs to be a longer-term responsibility until the horse is euthanized at the end of life or reaches its natural end of life?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. There should be a long-term responsibility and plan, and that plan starts early, and it starts. The point I made in the talk about education. So, if horses are educated only for racing in a particular way, that means that they can't be transitioned from the racetrack afterwards, or if they, in some cases, they never make it to the racetrack despite the education they're getting to intended to be racing. That's a problem. So I think the retirement plan starts before they enter the racing industry. It's not something that happens afterwards. It's about the way in which they're educated and what happens during their racing career. Yes, I think there's definitely, going back to what we said, who should be housing responsible for those horses. Clearly, a lot of people don't have the land to do so. A lot of horses are not suitable for a riding hack for a 10-year-old girl, for example, that is too dangerous. It's not the right sort of horse, too big and so on. So there are limited options for some of these horses, and that needs to be factored into any retirement plan. And it may be the responsibility of the breeders as one section of the racing industry, which I would like to see the whole racing industry, not just the breeders. I think they're an important part, but the whole racing industry being involved in the retirement plan, because the breeders are breeding horses, but they're not breeding them for themselves. They're selling them and they're in racing. So it's a whole of industry approach I think needs to be taken.
Yeah. Interesting. I'm going to squeeze one more question in there because it's relevant to what you've just said. If overbreeding and overproduction can't be solved within the current structures of our competitive animal industries, would it be possible to change the structure of the industries in entirety to help solve?
Possible, politically very challenging, as I was saying before. I mean, some places they've removed the whole industry, and I'm sure some people would like to see it all go. There's clearly good arguments for saying no use of animals for horse racing for human entertainment as such. So for some people, that is clearly an option. For other people, there's ways in which it could be made more humane. It might be to ban jumps racing, for example. It may be to race without the whips. I mean, personally, I think that's archaic, and there's ways in which you could maintain safety but not have whips being used. Other countries, Norway being an example, do those sort of things. So I think there's ways in which the racing industry can, substantial change can occur. I do think even though they are making improvements, they have made improvements in various areas over time, much more is needed and substantial changes are needed. Finding the political will and the support from a wider population to do that is really challenging. So I think it does need to be done, and it does to a large extent mean changing the economic structures and the cultural values within the current racing industry.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for sharing your very interesting perspective on the thoroughbred racing industry and overproduction. Really appreciate your time and your presentation today. So thank you, Phil.
Okay, thanks, Susan. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.